So I want to talk about Quebec because I think as a Canadian, it's a very important subject, and this is something I haven't really talked much about at all. So basically, I am an English Canadian in the sense like, yes, my ancestry is mostly German, but at the same time, German and Austrian, but like at the same time, English is the only language I speak. I'm from Ontario. I've lived in Ontario my whole life and not in the parts of Ontario that are like semi French themselves, because we do have some French speakers in Ontario. We have some regions of Ontario where French speaking people are a majority or a plurality or at least a significant minority. And I no, those are not the parts of Ontario I've lived in. But yeah, so my experience is very much that of an English Canadian. And by that I mean I've always been raised in an environment where people are very critical of Quebec. Like that's always been the thing in English Canada is people they call Quebec freeloaders. They say, well, they mooch off transfer payments. They impose bilingualism on us and all these inconveniences. They're French. They didn't support us enough in World War One or World War Two. Blah blah blah. And I used to really agree with this. Like, I used to be really critical of Quebec, as was everyone around me. I thought their language laws were super repressive and that English speakers in Quebec were very repressed. And I mean, I do still think English speakers in Quebec are repressed, but the difference is I've come to think that actually they're kind of the Quebecois, the French speaking Quebecers are kind of right to oppress them. And they're right to impose these language laws, and they are right to fight on behalf of their cultural identity. In fact, my only criticism now is that Quebec doesn't go far enough in some ways, because my criticism is they've adopted this linguistic nationalism that doesn't go far enough because it should also be an ethno nationalism. But at times they just say, oh, as long as you're French, that's all that matters. And to be fair, there are plenty of people in Quebec who disagree with this. But what I'm saying is that has basically become the party line of like the Bloc Québécois, the Parti Québécois. Probably, I would imagine Quebec Solidaire and other pro French parties within Quebec. I admit, like the distinction between these parties is a bit confusing at times because there's on a federal level and a provincial level, there's actually different parties. Like I think it's the Bloc Québécois on the shit. Is it the Bloc Québécois on the federal level and the Parti Québécois on the provincial level, or is it the other way around? I forget. I don't know if it's still like that, but it was like that at one point. So my point is, yeah, like the political landscape in Quebec is confusing, but overall, that's my main criticism of them is actually that they don't go far enough in the sense that their linguistic nationalism, I actually support that now, but I wish it would also translate into a more explicit ethno nationalism. So if anything, that's my criticism that it's not exclusive enough. But do I support Quebec separatism? Honestly, yes, I do. Like I've come to the point where it's actually like I do support it now. And not for the reasons and many English Canadians will say, "Oh, I support Quebec separatism because I want them to fuck off." And no, that's actually not my perspective. My perspective is frankly that they deserve it and it's what's better for them, and that through separating, they are the region of Canada that would be most likely to preserve a genuine sense of culture. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. Okay, first, some background history. Quebec was forcibly annexed into Canada. Like it did not choose to become part of Canada. Essentially, they were militarily defeated in the famous battle on the Plains of Abraham, which is still in Quebec City, which is still famously commemorated in Quebec to this day. People like even their license plates, "Je me souviens," mean I remember. I remember the time before the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, essentially, when Quebec was not part of Canada. And they're very nostalgic about that ideal. And Quebec the separatist movement in Quebec has existed throughout the centuries because Quebec has always been majority francophone, and the rest of Canada has always been, I believe, majority anglophone. I'm not sure if New Brunswick was ever majority francophone. I know today I think it's like between 20 and 35% francophone, somewhere in that region. But yeah, the rest of Canada as a whole has always been majority Anglo, and Quebec's always been majority French. There have been demographic shifts throughout the centuries. Like the English speaking population in Quebec was much higher in the early to mid 20th century and has actually declined since the 60s and 70s, because what happened was there was the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, which was a movement sort of against the authority of the Catholic Church, but also a French nationalist movement, which sounds a bit contradictory, but I mean, I think it parallels certain things that have happened in France itself, with the rise of secularism as an ideology. So it is, I guess, like, I mean, I don't agree with making like secularism or atheism an official value, but at the same time, it did lead to a rise in linguistic nationalism, which prompted Quebec in the 70s to pass a bunch of laws that restricted the use of English and promoted the use of French in public life. So, what happened with that was a massive exodus of Anglophones from Quebec starting in the 1970s. And Montreal used to be seen as the business capital of Canada, but nowadays it is undoubtedly Toronto, with Montreal being a distant second or even third. It might be like, even though Vancouver has fewer people in the metropolitan area than Montreal, it's arguable that Vancouver could be the second biggest business city in Canada and not Montreal. It's debatable. So yeah, as that happened, throughout the decades, there was a steady exodus of Anglophones out of Quebec. But what happened also is that with the rise of mass immigration, like mass third world, non-European immigration into Canada, there were an increasing number of allophones, which is the term they use in Quebec for people whose first language is neither French nor English, moving into Quebec. And many of these people prefer English over French, even though neither is their first language. So Quebec has had several referendums over the years about the question of sovereignty. And in 1995, they came very close to separating because they had a sovereignty referendum, and the votes were like, it was almost 50-50. It was very close. Now, to what I'm going to say to that is, I actually think the referendum is kind of bullshit, because the problem is that anyone who's a Quebec resident could vote, when really, if it was a fair referendum, it should have been limited exclusively to the ethnic Quebecois, because frankly, Quebec was annexed by Canada against its will, and by allowing everyone in Quebec to vote, they are also allowing English speakers and allophones to vote, when really the question of Quebec's sovereignty is fundamentally should be an internal debate among the Quebecois people. And I think that's what's bullshit about that referendum, because if the referendum had exclusively been open to people who are actually Quebecois, the separatist vote would have definitely passed. No question about it. The only reason it was so close and that the remaining Canada vote won is because of Anglophones and allophones, which I believe the term that some people in Quebec used at the time was money and the ethnic vote. So yeah, it's basically what they meant, was like non-Francophones, non-Quebecois. Now, as for like Francophones who aren't ethnically Quebecois, like all the Haitian immigrants, for instance, I am not sure how they voted in this referendum. But regardless, yeah, like the vote for remaining in Canada definitely won because of non-Quebecois people. So, in other words, Quebec has been annexed into Canada against its own will, and only the vote to remain in Canada was only won because of non-Quebecois people who live in Quebec. So there's that. But moreover, I think the bigger issue here is the question of Quebec's cultural identity. The fact is, Quebec, as the only majority French province in Canada and the only majority French place in North. In fact, the only majority non-English state or province in U.S. or Canada. I mean, I guess there's some in U.S. Is New Mexico majority Hispanic? Maybe, but at the same time, is Spanish more widely used than English in public life in New Mexico? I don't think so, although I'm not sure. But regardless, Quebec is a unique cultural unit. And we can see that in many aspects. Like I would say Montreal and Quebec City are among the most architecturally well-preserved cities in North America. Montreal is probably one of the most walkable cities in North America and has some of the best public transit. Although, again, unfortunately, they do still operate on the same Via Rail system between the cities and all the problems that involves. Although Via Rail between Montreal and Quebec City is at least more frequent than between most other major cities in Canada. So Quebec is a leg up, I would say, above the rest of Canada in that regard, like public transit and walkability and historic architecture, although, again, they're not perfect. But part of the problem is, again, I can't help but wonder, is it because they're part of Canada? If they were allowed to be their own country, would they improve upon these things further? And for instance, would they have like more vacation time? Well, I'm actually not sure on that one because bizarrely Saskatchewan has 3 weeks of vacation time, but Quebec only has 2 weeks like the rest of Canada, which is really odd because you'd think Quebec would be the province to have the most vacation time because in most regards, they're the most socialist province in Canada, which is something, again, they might go even further with if they were their own country. But nonetheless, my point is Quebec does have a unique cultural identity. They have a lot of festivals, for instance. There's one thing I noticed when I was in Montreal. There's always a different festival going on. Like, really, the only cities in North America that have that many festivals would be Montreal and New Orleans, probably. And it's like, again, what do they both have in common? French heritage. So, but moreover, I think my core point here is that the French heritage in Quebec is their biggest defense against bugmanism. It's the biggest defense against generic corporatized North Americanism, like mega chains everywhere, sprawling suburbs, everywhere looking the same, feeling the same. Like, I will say they have a certain built-in resistance to that the rest of Canada doesn't have to the same degree. And I'm not saying Quebec hasn't been affected by these things at all. Like, they actually have some of the most McDonald's per capita of any Canadian province, which is worrying. But at the same time, I do think in some ways they've preserved a unique culture better. Like, I mean, they use the 24-hour clock, which is no one else in North America does. And obviously there's the fact they use the French language, which is increasingly becoming bastardized. Like, I increasingly hear Quebecers speaking in some sort of portmanteau of French and English where they're just interchangeably going back and forth. Like franglais is what they call it, kind of like Spanglish in the United States. But yeah, I am worried that the longer Quebec stays in Canada, the more their cultural identity is going to be diluted. And I think the only way of keeping their cultural identity would be separatism. And in fact, demographic trends have actually shifted in recent years where ever since 2020, since the big event, for the first time in decades, the English-speaking population, like people whose first language in English, has actually increased in Quebec. And I think that's partly because of remote work offering new opportunities. And I think there are certain benefits of living in Quebec, like in terms of like lower prices for higher education. But again, they're placing restrictions on English speaking universities in Quebec. So I don't think that is the reason necessarily. I think the main reason, like lower housing prices is a factor because housing is less expensive in Quebec and potentially more available. So there is that. But I think another reason English speakers are now moving into Quebec since 2020 is frankly remote work. The fact that now they can live in Quebec, but yet work in for a company that is headquartered in another province or in another country, and thus not be subject to Quebec's language laws in the workplace. So that's a huge incentive right there because Quebec's workplace language laws make it very difficult for English speakers to work in Quebec in English. There's severe restrictions on like how big a company can be and operate in like using English in the workplace. I'm not sure to what extent they micromanage this. Like, do they actually police coworkers for having conversations in English in the office? I don't know. it sounds pretty draconian, but at the same time, it's like if that's what it takes to preserve your language, that's what it takes to preserve your language. Um, and it seemed to be working for decades. Like the English speaking percentage in Quebec was decreasing and French was actually remaining strong. But I think what's happened is the trends created by the events of 2020 have allowed people to work remotely, to live in Quebec and then work remotely and thus not be subject to Quebec's language laws, which has promoted more English speakers to move to Quebec. And secondly, I do think the long term trend of mass immigration of allophones, people who are neither English nor French in their first language, that has also contributed to French now starting to decline once again in the last few years. So sort of the chickens coming home to roost on that long-term trend, as well as the new trend of remote work. And I think part of what draws the remote workers is lower housing prices and more housing availability than the rest of Canada. But I think it's also that to some extent, a lot of these people, they like certain aspects of Quebec. They like the culture, they like the architecture, the food, the festivals, all these things. And it's kind of a bit parasitical because it's like they want to live there, but they also don't want to like speak French in day-to-day life. So it's a bit hypocritical and parasitical of them. It's like you like Quebec because it has all these cultural aspects that English Canada and the English United States lack largely. But yet by being there, you are diluting the Quebecois identity and thus contributing to the destruction of the culture that you're basically leeching off. So it's very hypocritical in that sense. And I do think that being non-English allows them a slightly greater resistance toward globo. I'm not going to say the term because YouTube would probably censor it, but you all know what term I'm referring to. Because yes, I mean, Quebec is very socially liberal in some ways, but I do think they have at least some concept of cultural identity and ethno-nationalism that the rest of us lack, where it's like they're not as keen to embrace this like, oh, we're a global village, we're a global marketplace, we're going to put the economy ahead of our culture. And many Quebecois are fine with the fact that Montreal is no longer the business capital of Canada and that Toronto is. In fact, many are happy about it. And I can understand why, because it's like, look what's happening to Toronto. Toronto is basically just a global marketplace. It is basically just a global economic zone where people from across the world come to make money. The city has lost much of its identity. It's really sad. Like, it just feels like a mishmash, a hodgepodge of random people from every corner of the globe. There's no cohesive identity. There's no cohesive culture. Even the food scene in the city, there's a lot of good food in Toronto, but there's nothing that's distinctly Toronto food. It's just a mishmash of cuisine from across the globe, whereas Montreal does have its own distinctive cuisine. There's poutine and all kinds of variations on it. There's tourtière. There's Montreal smoked meat sandwiches, smoked meat poutine. There's all kinds of variations of Quebec-style food. I believe they even have their own style of hot dogs and pizza and stuff like that. Like, there is a distinct Quebec cuisine, and we just don't have that in Ontario. And we don't have a lot of things that they have, like the festivals. We have some historic architecture. Like Toronto does have some historic architecture, but in Montreal, like they have the Old Port neighborhood, which is right in the center of the city and very well, not extremely well preserved, but pretty well preserved, like most of it is. And I would say overall, like, Montreal is more historically well preserved than Toronto in terms of the architecture. It's not perfect, but I'd say they definitely have more overall, and especially more in the very center of the city. Like in Toronto, the downtown isn't that well preserved. And it's like you have to go to the area surrounding the downtown to see the better preserved historic architecture, like say Cabbage Town or Harbour Village or the Annex or Leslieville, like those kinds of areas. Yeah, whereas Montreal, there's a lot of well-preserved historic architecture right in the historic city, like in the old port area, for instance, which is the oldest part of the city. And they also have, peripheral areas like Plateau de Mont Royal that have is like architecture that's still historic, like pre World War II, but more recent than in the old port. So yeah, I mean, and then there's Quebec City, obviously, which is very historic, very one of the definitely the best architecturally best preserved city in Canada and one of the best in North America. So I mean, and I mean even in terms of restaurants, like I mean, I guess Quebec, yeah, they seem to have a lot of McDonald's per capita from the statistics I've seen, but they do also have a lot of like independent restaurants like poutine places and stuff like that, which are their own local food, as opposed to like Ontario, where it's like what we have is just a mishmash of stuff. Like we also have poutine, it's just not as good as in Quebec. And well, except in certain parts of Eastern Ontario. But here in the part of Ontario where I live, like yeah, it's just a mishmash basically. Like that's how most of Ontario is, like Toronto and the surrounding area, like the Golden Horseshoe and that general entire part of Ontario. It just kind of feels increasingly just like a mishmash, like a global marketplace, a global village. And Quebec doesn't feel that way to the same extent, although it's starting in Montreal. And I can't help but feel that's because they're still part of Canada. Like maybe if they'd separated, they wouldn't have these problems to the same degree. And maybe separatism is their best hope of preserving their culture and their identity from becoming steamrolled by this soulless corporate money-making globalism like the rest of Canada. Like this is all we are. We're just a global marketplace, essentially. We're a place for people to make money, from people from every corner of the globe who have no tie to this region, who have no stake in our culture. They don't give a shit about our culture or our heritage. And Quebec, it's the one place that seems to still have these things in Canada. So, I mean, we shit on Quebec, but at the same time, I think some of it's out of jealousy. And I think we're hurting them by keeping them tied to the sinking ship that is Canada. Like in a cultural sense, we're definitely a sinking ship. And increasingly, perhaps economically too. Like it's a mess. It's getting rough in here. And people say, oh, Quebec couldn't survive on its own. It's like, who says they have to be 100% on their own just because they're their own country? You know, we can have deals, we can have trade agreements. We could have agreements about letting Canadians pass freely through Quebec between Atlantic Canada and the rest of Canada, about goods passing through freely. Like, I'm sure there can be certain stipulations on Quebec independence that they'd probably agree to about regarding like transportation between Atlantic Canada and the rest of Canada. I mean, if that was the thing, like I agree, from a Canadian perspective, that would be a non-negotiable. And I think Quebec would probably be willing to acquiesce on that specific point if it meant getting independence. So yeah, I mean, we could have like an EU style arrangement between Canada and Quebec, and hell, include the US as well. Just don't include Mexico. Please don't include Mexico. Um, I mean, there's no reason why we have to be solitudes just because we're different countries. Like, there's many countries within the EU that survive just fine, even though they're small countries, like Slovenia, which is way smaller than Quebec, or Belgium, or Denmark. Like, I just don't buy this argument. And I think it's partly the reason people make this argument is because from a North American perspective, it's so inconceivable that countries can be this closely knit. But it's like, why can't we be? You know, like, why can't we have these kinds of partnerships while still remaining? And we could have more independence than the EU, like in the sense, like we don't have to have free migration between countries like in the EU, but we can have some degree of partnership. Definitely free movement through Quebec from the rest of Canada to Atlantic Canada. I think that would be something that's important for sure. And trade between Atlantic Canada and the rest of Canada, like movement of goods unimpeded. No ridiculous fees, like nothing beyond what the normal fees would be if you were going within the same country. So yeah, I mean, those kinds of stipulations, I mean, I think they'd probably agree to it. Like, if I don't think they're unreasonable and unwilling to negotiate on points like that. And yeah, maybe parts of New Brunswick could join Quebec also. Like maybe there could be some land swaps or whatever where they get certain parts of New Brunswick and maybe we get like, I don't know, the parts of Quebec with English majorities are probably not significant enough that we'd get them, but maybe they could get parts of New Brunswick at very least. Who knows? If those parts would want to join an independent Quebec. So, yeah, I mean, overall, I think the proof is just okay. When you compare Toronto and Montreal today, I think Montreal's not doing perfectly, but they've preserved their sense of cultural identity, their sense of place, their sense of being something more than just a global marketplace. They've preserved it a hell of a lot better. And Quebec City sure as hell has preserved it a lot better than anywhere in Ontario. That's not even up for debate. And I mean, yeah, people are like, oh, it's just for tourists. It's Disneyland. It's like, you know what? I'd rather be Disneyland than be a fucking global marketplace. There are worse things to be than fucking Disneyland. And trust me, when you go to Toronto and you see the lack of culture, the lack of overarching identity, the way it just feels like an economic zone and not a place with its action, with a sense of cohesive identity or shared culture. Hell yeah, there's worse things than being Disneyland, as these modernists so derisively put it. Like, yeah, I'd rather be Quebec City. I'd rather be Montreal. The Montreal, again, is somewhere kind of in between, but I think if they had separated earlier, Montreal would be more like Quebec City is today. And I think if they separated now, they could at least maybe stop Montreal from going further in the direction of becoming like Toronto. So yeah, I mean, those are my thoughts on Quebec separatism. Honestly, vive le Québec libre. God bless them for being like one of the few parts of North America to maintain their own sense of identity and culture. And yes, I do think the French language is a core part of that. And I think that's what has allowed them to remain culturally distinct more so than other parts of Canada and other parts of the United States. Like, for instance, look at Louisiana. I think in some ways, if they'd kept their French language more so, they might be better preserved also. They actually do have more of a sense of cultural preservation than some parts of the United States. And I do think the French heritage is a contributing factor there too. So I don't know, maybe Louisiana should have its own separatist movement. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. Like, at the end of the day, I think regional identities are the best defense against homogenization. I think in some ways, smaller countries are better than bigger countries in terms of cultural preservation and in terms of defending themselves against the spread of globo. Again, not going to use the actual term because YouTube censors it, but you all know what I mean. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on Quebec.